You're listening to A Climate Change. This is Matt Matern, your host, and I've got Jeff Goodell on the program today. Jeff is a noted author. He's got a new book, The Heat Will Kill You First. Jeff has written a number of books. Of course, it's really timely to have Jeff on the show because we just had, on July 4th, 2023, the hottest day since records began being kept, according to the BBC. Forbes said it was the hottest day in over 100,000 years, breaking records for the second day in a row. 57 million people in the U.S. were exposed to dangerous heat on July 4th, 2023. And the World Meteorological Organization predicts there's a 98% likelihood in the next 5 years will be the warmest on record. So Jeff's book, The Heat Will Kill You First, is certainly a timely one given what's going on. Jeff's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He's also a Guggenheim Fellow in 2020. He's contributing editor to the Rolling Stone, wrote a book, Big Cold, A Dirty Secret, which was highly acclaimed, as well as How to Cool the Planet, Geoengineering and the Audacious Quest to Fix the Earth's Climate, as well as in 2017, The Water Will Come, Rising Seas, Sinking Cities, and the Remaking of the Civilized World, which the New York Times and the Washington Post both said were one of the best science books of 2017. So we got a lot to talk about, Jeff. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Matt. Great to be here.
So, you had written that maybe we might be windsurfing at the North Pole in 2040. Is that still something that's going to happen, or is that prediction a little bit too soon, or a little, is it going to be before 2040 or after 2040? I mean, how bad is this situation getting?
Well, I'm not sure the question of windsurfing at the North Pole is the arbiter of how bad the situation is going to get. We're certainly, it's, every 3-year-old knows when it gets hot, ice melts. So certainly one of the consequences of a rapidly increasingly hot planet is less and less ice. So, we're already seeing cruise ships, going through the Northwest Passage and through the Arctic in ways that were impossible a decade or so ago. So, and I went to Antarctica in 2019, saw the ice melt there and the ice shelves beginning to break up. So there's no question that we're going to see increased ice melt and rising seas as a consequence of it. But that's just one aspect of what it means to live on a hotter planet.
Yeah, certainly from what I've read, the poles are getting hotter faster than any place on the planet. So the stuff that we're kind of experiencing in more normally temperate climes down here in Los Angeles, and I guess you're in Austin, Texas, which are both can be very hot places, but it's not that unusual for LA or Austin to be hot, but probably not as hot as it's been.
Yeah, I mean, everyone says that, yeah, Texas is always hot, so what's the big deal? LA is always hot, so what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is it's getting hotter, and it's getting hotter for longer, and it's staying hotter. It's staying hotter at night, and these are indisputable facts that records keeping is proving here in Texas. We've had, I think El Paso's now had 12 days over 100 degrees. I mean, the sort of heat records are falling and falling. And, it's not just that, yes, it's always been hot. It's that we are adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, which we know as a scientific fact traps heat in our atmosphere. And as this heat is trapped, our atmosphere is getting hotter, and more extreme heat waves are a consequence of this. It is really very straightforward.
Well, obviously, we're having these heat waves, and where does that lead us? certainly there's some climate mitigation efforts that could be taken. From what I've read, cities tend to be heat islands. So if we plant more trees and more greenery, we may cool the place off, but that may be kind of band-aids on gunshot wounds. Or is that enough to kind of do some mitigation, or do we need wholesale changes? Or do we need both?
We absolutely need wholesale changes. Planting trees are great, but that's not going to save anybody or anything. I mean, that's just one aspect of much larger changes in how we live and how we get energy and power that are going to be required. I mean, until we stop burning fossil fuels, our planet is going to get hotter, and cities are hotter than sort of open spaces because they're built of steel and asphalt and concrete. Anybody who lives in LA or Texas or anywhere, any hot city, Vegas or whatever, knows when you go out into the street, you walk across the street, the asphalt is hot, the black asphalt absorbs and radiates the heat back. This causes this thing called, a heat island effect. So cities are as much as 20 degrees often hotter than the sort of surrounding area. And there are lots of ways to deal with that. Everything from, more reflective surfaces, white roofs. Even in LA, they're experimenting with white streets to help reflect some of that heat back up and not have it be absorbed by the asphalt. There are ways of changing how we build buildings, allowing more ventilation, things like that. But, ultimately, we need to stop cranking up the heat knob on the earth, on the planet. And to do that, we need to stop burning fossil fuels.
Well, you wrote a book about coal back in 2006, Big Coal, the Dirty Secret Behind America's Energy Future. Now, since that point in time, my understanding is our coal usage has gone down, and our renewable energy through solar and wind has increased and is now cheaper than coal. Isn't that a big win for the environmental movement, or is it, are we just patting ourselves on the back without really deserving it?
No, the decline of coal and kind of the tremendous decrease in the cost of renewable energy, solar and wind, is one of the most unexpected because of the speed and scale at which it's happened, and most inspiring aspects of this transformation that we're talking about. But the problem is we're not doing it fast enough. I mean, even here in Texas, which is the leader in the country in both wind and solar, right now on the grid in Texas, which is, the fossil fuel capital of the United States, 20 to 25% of the power that's, powering this city, right, or this state right now is coming from solar. And it's one of the reasons why we didn't have any blackouts or anything during this big heat wave that's happened in the last couple of weeks, because the solar has been so reliable. It actually functions better during these kinds of hot, sunny days than it does obviously in cooler and cloudy weather. But the problem is that, even though renewable power is getting cheaper and we're building a lot of it, we're not building enough of it. CO2 levels in the atmosphere are not declining fast enough. We are continuing to build things that require a lot of energy. We're not taking, gas plants offline. We're still, burning a lot of oil. The oil consumption is continuing to climb. When you look at the only real measure that matters in this story, which is the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, which are measured at Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii and has been measured since 1958, the level has continued to climb and climb and climb and climb. The curve is very steadily upwards. And as long as that curve goes steadily upwards, our planet is going to continue to get hotter. We're going to get hotter heat waves. We're going to get more sea level rise. You're going to have more erosion of the beaches. we're going to have spread of disease, all these things that are related to the sort of radical destabilizing of our planet that is underway right now.
And I'd ask the question is whether the strategy of kind of going to a more sustainable lifestyle and using less, consuming less, driving less, eating less meat is probably a more effective strategy to address this, or whether it's through technology and having electric cars and things of that nature.
Well, it's certainly not. It's not an either or thing. It's not like, we can choose between one or option A or option B. I mean, we need to. Consuming less is a good thing, for sure. Lowering our footprint, but it's also important to, replace dirty technologies with cleaner technologies. Solar power is better than coal power by any stretch of the imagination, by any measurement, not just the kind of climate, the CO2 levels and things like that, but costs. It's much cheaper, air pollution issues that are public health issue of dirty air. Solar panels don't do that. So there's lots of reasons why we want to push this energy transformation forward faster. But that's only
Jeff, I'm going to stop you there for 1 second, and we're going to go to break. You're listening to A Climate Change. This is Matern, and I've got Jeff Goodell on the program, author of the new book, The Heat Will Kill You First. And certainly we're all experiencing that around the country right now. We'll be right back in just 1 minute. And you're listening to A Climate Change. I've got author Jeff Goodell on the program. Jeff, I wanted to talk to you about kind of the language of climate change, and you're somebody who has written quite a bit on this topic for decades. And I had somebody on the program, David Fenton, who is a PR specialist, and David was kind of saying that the environmental movement has not been effective in a lot of the language that it's used to persuade people, and that some of this stuff kind of goes over normal people's heads, terms like climate change, net zero, and maybe we could use different terms. One of the terms he's talking about using is pollution blanket, and that has, I guess, polled better in communicating with average Americans. What are your thoughts on that front?
Obviously, people who care about this, and they're not environmentalists. I mean, this is something that, people of all kinds of persuasions, people who care about the economy, people who care about public health, people who care about energy, people who care about the future in all kinds of ways, people who care about war, are thinking about it and concerned about. And yes, we can do a better job of helping connect the dots with people, and between, the reason that, the East Coast had orange skies and this terrible air pollution in the last few weeks was because of the wildfires in Alberta. The reason that the wildfires in Alberta have been so big and so hot and so intensive is because the forests are so dried out. The reason they're so dried out is because it's so hot. The reason it's so hot is because we've been burning fossil fuels and putting CO2 into the atmosphere, which has heated things up, as we talked about earlier. So helping to connect the dots about the kind of cascading consequences of what we're doing. The drying up of Lake Mead, drinking water for LA, for Southern California, all these is a similar kind of case. I don't think it's just a question of changing the language. And first of all, I've never heard the phrase pollution blanket, but I don't think it's just a matter of different words. I think it's a matter of speaking more directly about the issue and speaking about it in ways that connect to people's lives. Inflation prices, the high cost of food, and what is the link between that and climate change and CO2 in the atmosphere? I think speaking about things like that people care about is what we need to do better, and not just merely change the words.
Right. Well, I saw one of the videos that Yellow Dot had put out recently, and David Fenton is associated with them, and they were using Darth Vader to talk about Exxon and the fact that Exxon had known about the effects of use of fossil fuels and rising CO2 levels, and it would cause catastrophic climate change, and yet continued to do it and buried their own research. And it was a very effective use of kind of comedy, as well as something that everybody kind of knows in popular culture, Darth Vader, and associating him with the evils of Exxon. You know, should we be doing more of that stuff to kind of catch the mass audiences?
Maybe, I don't know. I mean, I think there's lots of different ways of talking about this and different messaging. Certainly, there are some people that will resonate with, others obviously it won't. I mean, I was just talking to some video game developers who are working hard to try to get climate issues, kind of situations, climate related situations, built them into games as a way of helping educate people about what's going on. I mean, the real question here is this is not about PR. This is about education. How do we communicate and help people understand what is happening, and not, I mean, it's a very political story and it's all about politics in a certain way, but it's not politicized per se. This is science. This is like gravity. This is like, what time does the moon go up? And what time does the moon set? I mean, there are certain physical facts here that are incontrovertible to anyone who, believes in science at all, of course. But,
I guess that's the problem, is that it has become so politicized that there's a large segment of the population that is turning off when they hear anything about it, and kind of reaching out to that group. I don't know if I had the answer, I'd be, clear in what I would say. How do we do it? But as to you as a writer, are you writing to that person, or are you saying, hey, I don't know if I'll ever communicate to that person who's denying that climate change exists?
Yeah, I'm not interested in trying to reach that person myself. I mean, there are other people whose work is focused on that, and I think it's really important. It's really great, and all power to them. But I've been writing about this for 20 years. I know every time I give a talk anywhere, I get asked the sort of same basic, these a certain kind of category of denier will ask me questions about things, about basic science, about, CO2 is, good for the atmosphere. It's good for plants. It's a better, greener world. And, anyone who, for me, again, it's a really important conversation to have. I'm really happy that there are a lot of people who are engaging in that conversation, but that's not the conversation that I personally am engaged with. I'm engaged with trying to talk to people who understand the basic science, who are not in denial about the role of burning fossil fuels, the role of CO2 in our atmosphere, but don't really understand the consequences very well, and don't really understand the urgency, don't really understand the science behind, crop failure, and how crop failure is linked with these rising temperatures and increasing droughts, and helping paint the larger picture of what's happening in our world, rather than fighting in the trenches over basic science.
Yeah, I mean, if I could break it down, and I don't know this to be true exactly, but kind of in my general understanding, like 25% of the US population is pretty environmentally conscious and really pushing forward, kind of in the green camp. And then you've got maybe 25% that are kind of in the denial Trump camp. And then you've got 50% that, may acknowledge that environmental global warming is occurring, but are not very engaged on it. they're acknowledging that there's a problem, but they're just kind of unconscious to it and not really working in any meaningful way to make changes in their life or in public policy. And to me, that's probably the group that maybe the message is most important to convey to.
Well, I mean, I think it's all important, but I do think, that's sort of the group that I'm sort of targeting. When you get into this sort of anti-science, anti-vax, hardcore MAGA crowd, who see anyone who talks about this as being in some kind of grand conspiracy, and this is all about Bill Gates or something. I mean, I don't know where to go with that, and that's not the conversation that I'm interested in engaging with. Even though, like I said, I'm all the power to people who are doing that. I want to speak to the people in the middle who understand the basics but don't understand the nuances and the urgency.
Well, let me talk to you about that a little bit, because you're in Texas, and certainly there are blue islands of cities in Texas that are fairly, left-leaning, I guess you'd say, a bit. And then there are massive parts of the rural parts of Texas that are very red. So how have you found it living in Texas, and what kinds of good changes? Obviously, 25% of their energy coming from solar is pretty remarkable. And I understand they're also a wind leader as well. Though I've heard that the governor and the legislature in Texas is trying to kind of put roadblocks in the way of further solar and wind development. What's going on there?
Well, in Texas, energy has become a kind of culture war. Fossil fuels have become symbols of a kind of way of life, and clean renewable energy is somehow linked with like woke culture and all that kind of thing. And to me, it's a stupid and tragic kind of debate, but it's not going to last long, because wind and solar are booming here, and the economic power of wind and solar is growing so fast. And people here, I mean, I'm living it every day. I see it. I mean, they're like really interested in developing wind and developing solar, because they can make a lot of money, and because it's in their financial interest to do that. And that is a really good thing. And that's a huge change from even a decade ago, when solar and wind required subsidies and government help. Who requires government help now? Who requires subsidies now? Fossil fuels. And so the only way fossil fuels are going to extend their lives, is by government support, which is very ironic given the sort of freedom, calls of the sort of far-right Republicans.
Ironic indeed. And obviously, I think that one of the ways moving the environmental conversation forward faster is, talking about the profitability of them as a business proposition, and linking positive change to making money. And those two things get the country rolling in the right direction. So you're listening to A Climate Change. This is Matern, your host, and I've got Jeff Goodell on the program, who's the author of The Heat Will Kill You First. We'll be back in just 1 minute to talk to Jeff about the book, and so stay tuned. You're listening to A Climate Change. I've got Jeff Goodell on the program. The Heat Will Kill You First. Jeff, your book that's coming out. Tell us a little bit about how you decided to write this book, and what do you think is the most important message coming out of the book?
Well, I decided to write this book because I happened to be in Phoenix on a day when it was 117 degrees about 4 years ago, and I had to walk 10 or 12 blocks downtown to a meeting, and I made that walk, and I thought the heat was going to kill me. It was just extraordinary. And I grew up in California. I'm not like, I didn't grow up, in the Arctic Circle or something. It's not like I'm unfamiliar with it, but on that day and that extreme, when it was that extreme, I really understood the risks of heat in a way that I didn't before. And I began just to think about, like, okay, so, we talk about global warming all the time, but, what are the real implications of heat? What does it really do to your body? Why did I feel so dizzy and weird at the end of that 12-block walk? What is heat? Even though I had been covering climate change for a very long time, I could not tell you what heat was. I mean, it's obviously a rise in the mercury in a thermometer, but what actually is heat? And so it brought up a lot of really interesting questions to me. And I thought it was a worthy subject for a book. Because for a book, you're going to be, it's like, choosing a spouse or something. You're going to be with it for a long time, and you're going to be living in hard times and good times with that partner, whether it's a book or a spouse. And so you should choose wisely, something that is of interest. And this felt interesting. And what's the most important thing to take away from it? The most important thing to take away from it is that, like me, when I started the book, we don't understand heat. People don't understand heat. People don't understand how it works, how dangerous it is, what the risks are, the difference between dry heat and wet heat, what happens to your body, how to protect yourself. I mean, people think, oh, if I just drink enough water, whatever I do, I'll be fine. Well, no, that's not true. You can still die of heat stroke, even though you are, have all the water you need to drink. So there's just a lot of myths and misconceptions about heat. And as our planet gets hotter, as more and more of us are exposed to extreme heat conditions, whether we're out hiking, playing football, playing frisbee, walking our dog, dealing with relatives, this knowledge is really important. And I hope my book helps advance that.
Well, tell us a little bit about the point at which the human body can no longer take it. I recall reading something that at 130 degrees, essentially a human body will just break down no matter what kind of shape you're in, and you're pretty much toast. Is there some variance at that, like a bell curve? Some people might not be able to take 120 or 115 or 110, depending on your physical condition.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on a lot of things. There's no one place for all people. There's no bright line of, when you cross over to, what will kill you and what won't. It depends on, first of all, whether it's wet heat or dry heat, so humid or not. LA is obviously quite dry heat. The Philippines or Miami is wet heat. And there's a big difference. 110 degrees in LA is not like 110 degrees in Miami, because in Miami it's humid. And, the only way that our bodies know that our bodies are able to dissipate heat is by sweat. And so if you are sweating in LA and it's 110 degrees, it's dry heat, and the sweat can evaporate and your body can cool off, because the evaporation cools the blood near the skin, and that circulates through your body and cools things off. If you're in Miami and it's 110 and very humid, that sweat doesn't evaporate. And so basically it breaks the cooling mechanism in your body. And so that is one difference that makes a huge difference in your sort of survivability of different kinds of heat levels. Another is your basic health. The way that your body cools is by sweating. And the way sweating works is that when it gets hot, your heart pumps a lot of your blood away from the inner core of your body towards your skin in order to get it to where it can be cooled by this evaporation process. But your heart has to work really hard to do that. So anybody who's been out on a hot day knows that their heart starts pounding faster and faster. So if you have a heart problem, if you're on medication that has issues that affects your heart, that can increase your risk hugely. So that means, in general, older people, less well people are far more vulnerable to heat than younger, more in shape kind of people. And thirdly, another big factor is what you're doing. Right? If you're sitting, just sitting there doing nothing on whatever the given temperature is, you can tolerate the heat a lot better than if you're trying to run a 4-minute mile, right? And as you exercise, or if you're in a work crew on a highway, or you're working as a farm worker in the fields, in Central California or in Oregon or somewhere like that, your body is creating a lot of heat by your movement as your muscles move and things that creates inner heat. So you overheat much more quickly if you're exercising on a hot day. Everybody knows this intuitively because they've experienced it, but they don't know it consciously, and they don't know how to take precautions against it. And so those are 3 of the key things.
So is the record heat going to wake people up around the world and get people serious about global warming? Do you see some effects? Do you see that consciousness rising, or not so much?
Well, years ago, Al Gore told me that everybody who cares about climate change has what he called an oh shit moment, where they realize what's at stake and what the consequences are. And, I asked President Obama when I had a chance to talk with him, and I went to Alaska with him in 2015. And I asked him what his oh shit moment was. And for him, it was, he spent a lot of time growing up in Hawaii and seeing what was happening to the coral reefs there as they become bleached as the ocean temperature rises. That has a big impact on coral reefs. And for him, the coral reefs were his oh shit moment. And so, I think everybody has a different moment of what wakes them up.
So what was your oh shit moment?
My oh shit moment actually came in West Virginia when the New York Times asked me to go down and write about coal and the coal mining. This was like 22 years ago. And I saw these mountains being blown up for the coal. And then I visited some coal plants and saw these enormous industrial machines burning tons and tons of these black rocks, and how primitive that was, and how it was basically the same thing that people were doing in Charles Dickens' time. And I then began to think about the warming and what the consequences of all that was. And that was because I grew up in California. There's no coal in California. I never thought about coal. I had no idea that at that time, half of our electricity came from coal. So that was my sort of oh shit moment. But the question of what the kind of collective oh shit moment is, where, I don't think there's going to be a kind of sudden mass awakening. I think it's going to be a long, slow transformation. I think it's going to be pushed along by the economics that we talked about. I think it's going to be pushed along by people getting more educated about the risks. I think that, we're seeing things like, sea level rise, which is what my last book was about, insurance prices rising radically in Florida and in parts of California. There's the public health, people dying from inhaling wildfire smoke, the understanding of the consequences of that, all of this stuff happening in real time around us, I think is driving a slow but gradual and real awakening to the consequences and costs of our way of life right now.
So what do you see as the 5 most significant positive signs that people and government are actually starting to meet the challenge of climate change?
Well, I think, first of all, we've talked about the tremendous fall in the price of energy. That's hugely of clean energy, and that's hugely kind of inspiring in the sense of, it's now possible and in fact profitable, and for everybody, not just the energy producers, but for me and you when we pay our electric bills, if that electricity comes from renewable power. So that's huge. That's a huge thing. I'm seeing a big shift away from kind of climate denial. 10 years ago, there were a lot of people who were just flat out deniers, thought that, this whole thing was, as Trump, famously said, a kind of climate change was a Chinese hoax. I think that's, there's very few or significantly less people in that camp now than there used to be. I think so. I think that's very inspiring. And I think, another thing that I've seen in, my 20 years of writing about this and thinking about this is it's just become much more broadly part of our culture and of our cultural conversation, what's going on here and what do we need to do and how do we need to think about this. When I first started writing about climate change and energy, clean energy, more than 20 years ago, I would tell people at dinner parties or, that I met in various places about writing about climate change, and they would look at me and smile and it kind of as if I were writing about the sex life of porcupines or something. It's a sort of weird thing that nobody really cares about, but that's cute that you're doing that. It must be really interesting.
Yeah,
And
good
now,
for you. Yeah.
yeah, right. And now when I go and meet people who don't know what I'm doing and I tell them, they're like, oh my God, really? That's so interesting, and where should I move? Or, how do I get solar panels on my house? Or are heat pumps do they really work? And, everybody wants to talk to me about it now. And it's a really huge cultural change. It's not me, it's them.
Right. Well, three, we'll be back in just 1 minute. I'm talking to Jeff Goodell, author of the new book, The Heat Will Kill You First. And stay tuned, talk to Jeff a bit more. You listen to A Climate Change. I got Jeff Goodell on the program, who's a noted author. He's got a book coming out, The Heat Will Kill You First. And Jeff, you were just in the middle of telling us about the 5 most positive signs. To recap, clean energy, the shift from the climate denial people, and the cultural conversation has definitely shifted in the last 20 some years. What are the last 2 things that round out your top 5?
Well, I think, I think that, I think cities are starting, how we live in urban areas is beginning to change dramatically. I think that people are tired of and understand the problems with sort of endless car culture, endless concrete, endless asphalt. We've paved over, it was the Joni Mitchell Paving Paradise, put up a parking lot. Is that a Joni Mitchell song?
Yeah.
I think that era is coming to a close. I think that, cities around the world are thinking differently about how to move people around, how to live, how to bring nature into cities again, which I think is a huge issue that has a lot of implications for transportation, for heat, and for kind of quality of life. So I think that is another one. And that's 4. What is my 5th? What would my 5th one be? This is not a kind of happy thing, but I think that scientists and others like myself who pay attention to scientists are really starting to see the subtle implications of warming and of what we're doing to our planet. And so things like, we're starting to see that even a few small changes in warming have big implications for things like spread of disease and food prices and food crops. I also think, another hopeful thing is I'm a big fan of, fake meat. I think that getting away from beef, cattle consumption, cattle, the sort of industrial feedlot thing is a big deal for climate. And it's a very controversial thing to talk about here in Texas. But even here in Texas, at my grocery store down the street in Austin, they just put in this giant plant-based meat butcher shop. It's like all these different cuts, all these different seasons. They wear white aprons. It looks like a butcher shop, but it's for sort of plant-based meats. And I saw that and I thought, this is changing. If you can do that in Austin, Texas, then something's happening in the sort of meat food world that is interesting. And so I think that's kind of inspiring too.
Yeah, certainly there has been a shift, and I can say I was at a restaurant here in LA. It was a vegetarian place, and they came up with this meat concoction that actually tasted pretty damn close to meet. I mean, like they're really getting good at it. So it
Yeah,
used to be 20 years ago, it wasn't even close.
right.
Now it's getting pretty close.
It is. It
So
is.
that's good news. Okay, so now we're going to flip the coin on this and just say what are the five most distressing signs that people, government, corporations are not meeting the challenge?
Well, this is going to repeat some of the things that I've said. One is the kind of the way that this energy fight, this energy transition has become a cultural war. I think that's a really big issue that basically, burning fossil fuels, has become, the sort of, if you're a real American, you burn coal, oil, and gas. And if you're a woke commie, hippie, tree hugging, liberal wussy, then you embrace solar and wind and things like that. And you're part of the woke mob. And that I think is insane, stupid, wrong, and kind of depressing. And like I said, I don't think it's going to last long. But that's not an encouraging thing. The fact that our planet has warmed a little bit more than 1 degree centigrade. That's 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit since the Industrial Revolution. And when we started burning fossil fuels, and everyone had always said that, burning that 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming was the danger threshold. We're already hitting that danger threshold. The climate impacts are happening much faster. These extreme heat things are an example than climate scientists suspected even 10 years ago. So our climate is more sensitive than we understood 10 years ago. That's kind of disturbing. The general kind of, I think that popular culture has failed in a big way to really engage and help educate people about climate. I was just at a meeting last week, speaking of LA, with Hollywood writers and producers talking about how to get stories about climate change into the masses, into theaters, into the public discussion more. They've been reluctant to talk about it, to do it, because it's polarizing, because it's seen as too nerdy, too scientific-y. And so that failure, I think, has left a lot of people. I mean, it's a very powerful tool for educating people that has not been utilized well enough. And I think that's kind of disappointing, but I think that's going to change. So those are, what is that, 3 or 4?
That's 3, but we'll move on to something else. If you were given an opportunity to make one change in the U.S. law or policy to stop global warming, what would it be?
Oh, easy. I mean, ban fossil fuels. I mean, or put it, I don't mean ban them as in like turn them off tomorrow, but I mean, remove all subsidies from fossil fuels, put us maybe even something like a carbon tax that would do for fossil fuels sort of what we did for cigarettes, make them really expensive, make it even more expensive than they already are, and pull every lever I could to accelerate this transition, because that's what's important, is making this happen faster and faster.
Yeah, I would think a carbon methane tax would probably be the most efficient thing that we could do. So I'm assuming you're not a Trump supporter, as a man who's, Trump is the most anti-climate change person on the planet. But is there anything that Trump has done that you would agree with?
No.
I would say the only silver lining is that he kind of woke me up and lots of others to start taking action, particularly at the state and local levels, that after he got elected, it kind of like, oh my God,
Yes, that's true. And that's right. And that's good. And he has woken up a lot of people, and he has, mobilized a lot of people, and, put a certain kind of fear, whether it's for democracy or whether it's for, women's right to choose, or whether it's for climate, into a lot of people and activated a lot of people. And I agree with that. I think that's been, and we're really lucky that he's just sort of so dumb. I mean, if he were like as charismatic and ruthless as he is and dishonest as he is, but we're a little smarter, we'd be in a lot more trouble.
Probably so. So flipping the coin on that, for the Mount Rushmore of climate change heroes, who are the 4 people you put up on this mountain?
Oh, my goodness. Oh, wow. That's a question that in my 20 years of getting interviewed and things, I've never had before. Well, I think maybe first one of them would be Eunice Foote, a scientist, highly unrecognized, but did some really important work in understanding how CO2 traps heat in the 19th century. Very unrecognized in the history of climate science. I would say that she's really one of them. I would say, I would have to put Al Gore up there simply because of, I think he understood this early on and was a powerful figure in that. Greta Thunberg, I think, has done, has been really important, obviously, in activating youth. And then Jim Hansen, the scientist who in 1988 in front of Congress, he was a NASA scientist. He's retired now. He's still alive. A NASA scientist who famously testified before Congress that the signal of global warming has been detected. We know now that this is happening beyond a shadow of a doubt. So those would be my
Jeff, it's been great having you on the program, and please, everyone, go out and get a copy of Jeff's new book, The Heat Will Kill You First. Follow him on his social media. He's always on the cutting edge of reporting on the climate. We're going to have Sir Jonathan Porritt on the show next week, a noted English environmentalist. And follow us on all our social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Give us a review, send us some questions. Please let us know what guests you'd like to hear from, and also go to Apple or Spotify to listen to this episode or any of the other 100+ episodes we have, or check us out on climatechange.com. And in the coming week, let's all go out there and take some action to address climate change. Talk to people use less products, volunteer, plant trees, eat less meat, and be the change you want to see in the world. Until then, have a great week, everybody.